Today was the second game of the match between Levon Aronian and Hikaru Nakamura in the FIDE Grand Prix finals that are being held in Berlin right now. So they drew yesterday in game 1, this was game 2, and they're playing for points to see if they can secure a spot in the candidates. They go to tie breaks tomorrow if today ends in a draw. So Levon had white today, he kicked off with e4 here, and we went in for this Italian game today. Yesterday Hikaru played the Ruy Lopez with bishop b5, today bishop c4. So the bishop came to c5 from Hikaru, we had pawn to d3, knight f6, castles from white, pawn to d6, all very standard stuff from both players. Pawn to c3 now, so white doesn't have a knight on the c file like black does, and therefore has this option of setting up the fluid pawn centre. We had pawn to a6, giving this bishop some room, all very standard. Pawn a4 gains some space. The bishop dropped back to a7, prophylaxis there, anticipating pawn to d4 here. Now we had knight a3, and it might look slightly strange to put it on the edge. A knight on the rim is dim, as they say. It reduces the scope of the jumps, but it's coming back to c2, then it will support the e3 square, as we'll see. So knight to e7 was played. You could have castled there, but Naka starts this very standard remaneuver of this knight to g6, where it looks at f4. You clear the c pawn. Now we had knight to c2, knight to g6, and the bishop came to e3, challenging the influence of this one. An exchange occurred here. You can recapture with the pawn for some dynamic play, not that it's necessarily best, but it's interesting. But the knight recaptured instead, super solid, looking at these light squares, castles from black, and now pawn to a5 from Levon. So we can see that white just has a small edge in these positions. You've got the cramping pawn here, you've got a slightly more fluid centre, you're holding the breaks at the moment. So okay, Hikaru just has to be on slightly the defensive right now, looking to equalise. So pawn to c6 came, potentially preparing d5 later. The bishop dropped back to b3, anticipating that. We had pawn to h6, bishop to c2. Again, very standard. You want to overprotect e4 so that you can prepare to play d4 at a later point. We had rook to e8 now from Naka. Levon brought his rook over to the e file, and now queen to c7 from Naka. He could have also considered d5 there, breaking in the centre first, but he prefers to first activate the queen a little, perhaps even try and get this bishop developed, connect the rooks, then push in the centre. But this does give Levon to now be the first to the punch. He pushes d4, striking at black's pawn centre here, and Naka decides to take. Now the queen recaptured here, keeping this d file open and looking at this d6 pawn, which could become weak. So Naka has to be a bit strategically careful here, because he now has to defend a weakness. White is rock solid. So how does he respond to this? Well, he pushes pawn to c5, going for this active plan, kicking the queen back from this nice centralised square, and now following up with bishop to g4 here. It's worth noting though that you can't take the pawn on e4 as black, or then you're running into knight to d5. Your queen is hit, you don't have time to take the white queen, or we have this intermezzo, rook takes with check, then you're picking up the queen here, better for white. And if you try and play something like queen d8 to defend the rook, well then you simply lose the knight in the middle of the board. None of the tactics are working. So that's why after queen to d2, instead Naka goes bishop to g4. And it puts an uncomfortable question to Levon here. Do you want to let black double your pawns? Then we might have knight h4 coming. Just gets a bit tricky, you're losing control potentially. So Levon plays the best move in the position here, which is to capture that bishop on g4. The knight recaptures, but now Naka's starting to get some piece play. And what we notice is that this knight can actually hop around a bit to e5 or f6. This knight is a bit cramped. Both of its jumps are controlled by pawns here, and so that's why queen d1 was played. Looks a bit weird to move that queen again, but Levon wants knight d2 here. So we had pawn to b5 from Naka now. He could have played slowly there with knight f6 or bringing a rook across. but instead he goes for this active move. He allows en passant on b6, the queen recaptured, and now Levon as good as offers a draw basically with knight to d2, leaving the b pawn to be taken. So he could play rook to a2 here, holding that pawn, or even rook to b1, or pawn to b3, and okay, we carry on playing chess. Instead he goes knight to d2. Now this opens up the attack of the queen on the black knight, but it allows Naka to take this pawn on b2. Now if you capture this knight, black takes the bishop here, which is now hanging, and you've won back your piece and you're a pawn up. This one's also weak. Not good for white. So after this pawn was taken by Nakamura, knight c4 was the prepared move. Now you can't retreat here down the b file. I mean, you're running into forks here, but also your knight is still attacked. So you have to keep tabs on this bishop. So the queen captured on c3. Still you can't take here or you lose here. And instead, therefore, we had knight to b6. It hits the rook. Naka moved that one away, which is the best move, but now the knight comes into d5, hitting the queen here. And once again, you have to keep eyeing this bishop so that you don't lose the knight here. So the queen came to b2, but this allowed rook to b1. The queen has to come back here. We had rook a1, queen b2, rook b1, and so on until the game ended in a draw here. So no fireworks there, I'm afraid. We go to tie breaks tomorrow. Hopefully it gets more exciting. If you enjoyed this game, then do subscribe to the channel, and see an amazing Hikaru Alireza Firouzja game, click here. Thanks very much for watching. See you soon.